about this. As usual, this webinar will be recorded. It will be posted to the YouTube channel as we've done for the last couple of years. I dropped the link in chat in case you are not familiar with it. During our presentation or webinar today, please feel free to put questions in chat. Our team will be waiting and eager to respond to your questions. One thing we would ask is please make sure that your cameras are off. We've had some challenges in the past. So keep in mind, aside from this webinar, we are going to post these recordings again to the webinar. So whatever your camera's on is going to live in infamy. In time for meetings, we will open up the floor for questions when we're done with the webinar before we close today. Okay. Before I get started, we do have an obligatory bad dad joke. So Leo, I have a question for you today.
Here we go again.
Yep.
Hit me.
What was the turkey thankful for in Thanksgiving?
I don't know.
Vegans. Okay. So I warned you it's a bad dad joke. So without further ado, we'll get started today. Our very first presenter is somebody that may be familiar to some of you. Her name is Bhavana Bhatia. She likes to go by Bibi. So Bibi, without further ado, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Barry. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this session. Today, we will be talking about the new Purview Deployment Blueprint, where we will emphasize the secure by default approach with Microsoft Purview. And we'll also show you how it can protect your data from oversharing. So I'm joined here by my colleague, Leo Ramirez. So I and Leo will be presenting this session together. Now, many of you here may be familiar that Microsoft Purview provides efficient and robust data security solutions to protect your data. And this protection is centered around applying sensitivity labels to your data, which encrypts the data and also prevents oversharing. You can then integrate sensitivity labels, then data loss prevention, and also insider risk management for fortifying your overall data security. We have been previously recommending the crawl, walk, run approach to deploy Purview data security. But the traditional crawl, walk, run approach can turn out to be slow, which can lead to limited labeling adoption. Now, given that this is the era of AI, organizations want to quickly scale their data protection needs, and there has been a mind shift in the labeling deployment strategy. We now recommend that organizations consider the secure by default labeling approach and train the users to update the labels for sharing exceptions instead of training users when to protect the content. Now, please note that this is an alternate approach and it does not replace the crawl, walk, run approach. So if your organization is comfortable with or in the middle of the crawl, walk, run approach, you can continue using that. But you also now have a new approach that can be considered. Now let's quickly see what are some of the traditional labeling concerns that end up delaying Purview deployments. Firstly, government organizations have a lot of agencies and they end up spending a lot of time deciding how their labeling taxonomy should look like. Also, we are seeing that organizations are spending too much time defining what data should be classified as confidential, what should be classified as highly confidential, and also what exact sensitive content should be identified within data at rest so that our customers can make their auto labeling policies perfect. Also, sometimes there's too much emphasis on securing tented projects or those one-off requirements, which ends up leading to creating hundreds of labels that are not only complex to deploy, but also difficult to maintain. So this new secure by default Purview blueprint will address some of these concerns, and it will also provide you clear guidance on the data security deployment. Now, to enable organizations to accelerate securing content and deploy Purview faster, our product engineering team has released this deployment blueprint. And these deployment blueprints are based on proven deployments within organizations. They are designed for IT professionals, for security professionals, and also compliance officers who are responsible for deploying and managing Purview in their organization. Now, this blueprint provides a recommended sensitivity label taxonomy that any organization can quickly get started with. It also provides options for end users to manage exceptions if encryption prevents them from working effectively. So we recommend starting your data security journey with this labeling taxonomy at the tenant level for most customers. So start with the 4 parent labels: public, general, confidential, highly confidential. Now, public means data is unrestricted and is meant for public consumption, and it can be shared freely. This label does not apply any encryption or restriction. Then general means this is day-to-day transactional data between internal users and other trusted partners or vendors. And this data, again, is not meant for public consumption, but this label does not enforce any encryption or restriction. Then confidential means this is sensitive business data with limited distribution. Highly confidential could be your most critical data that can be shared with limited individuals only. Now, these confidential and highly confidential labels will have sub-labels that decide the scope of permissions on the content. So, example, confidential all employee sublabel will provide permission to all full-time employees in the organization to access the content. Then confidential specific people label will provide permission to people specified by the owner of the document. Okay, so this is going to be user specified. Now, if you know the document is confidential, but can't have rights management or permission set on the file because you don't know who the audience of the document is going to be, then you can use the confidential internal exception label. This label will not apply any encryption. Then you can create similar sublabels for highly confidential labels as well. So here we have highly confidential all employees, specific people, as well as internal exception. Now the labels general, confidential, and highly confidentials can be applied to files, to emails, meetings, as well as to SharePoint sites. When you apply labels at the site level, you can control the external guest settings, site privacy, and also the default sharing links of documents in the sites as well. So example, if a SharePoint site has a confidential all employees label, then external guest sharing settings will not be allowed. Okay. And then the privacy of the SharePoint site will be set to private. And the default sharing link of the documents will be set to share with people within the organization. Then similarly for this confidential specific people, the default sharing link can be specified to specific people instead of sharing documents for people in the organization. So all these settings are very important to consider because it provides just enough access to the content so that only authorized users can access it. And all this ultimately helps you prepare for generative AI as well as to roll out Microsoft 365 Copilot confidently in the future. Next, we recommend that you set the email default label to general. And for document default, you can opt for confidential all employees label. Then based on specific sensitive information types that are identified within the files, you can automatically apply the highly confidential label to the document. Now try to keep the labeling structure simple like shown here. If your agencies are asking for specific labels, you can create sub-labels and publish the labels only to those agencies. And all the labels created should be self-explanatory and clearly named. So avoid mixing terms like confidential, restricted, and internal, because your users can get confused on whether restricted is more sensitive than confidential or is confidential more sensitive than restricted, right? So keep it simple, like confidential and highly confidential, so that there is clear distinction in the sensitivity level of the content. Then wherever possible, keep the list of labels to 5 by 5. That means up to 5 parent labels and up to 5 child labels under a parent. Also, we recommend that you don't wait for auto labeling perfection to start with better defaults. And also don't wait on label exceptions like tented projects or those one-off specific needs to start with better defaults. You can get started with this recommended taxonomy here and then build on top of this in the future. All right, now that we have the labeling taxonomy in place, we can start using this secure by default blueprint. As you can see here, this blueprint has 4 phases. There's a foundational phase, there's managed phase, optimized phase, and a strategic phase. The idea here is to start protecting your new or updated Microsoft 365 content first. Then you can start protecting your priority Microsoft 365 content. Then start protecting your historical Microsoft 365 content. And then extend the protection beyond Microsoft 365. This blueprint is closely aligned with how Microsoft also has deployed data security internally. So I'm now going to talk about the foundational and the managed phases of this blueprint. And then Leo will be talking about the optimized and the strategic phases of the blueprint. So let's get started with the foundational phase. The first step is to create the label taxonomy that I showed you previously. Then you can set the default label to general for emails because you will be sending emails to internal as well as external users frequently. Now, if a confidential or a highly confidential label document is attached to the email, then make sure that the email inherits the label of the attachment. Then next, set the default label to confidential all employees for your files, and then ensure that only internal employees will have access to it. Now, this will drastically simplify your data security strategy because all new files or updated files will now onwards be treated as confidential or secure by default. We will then train users on managing exceptions by changing the labels if they want to share the content outside the organization. This is going to be a cultural change, and training users will become an important step in the deployment. Now, though encryption is a highly recommended step here, it is not mandatory. You can also get started with default confidential labels without encryption if required, and then add encryption later on. Then next, consider applying container labels without container labels to all your SharePoint sites because it drastically reduces oversharing problems. You can leverage SharePoint admin portal, or you can also use Graph API to address sites without container labels. Now let me show you some demos for these steps that we discussed here. So I'm right now inside the Microsoft Purview portal, and I have created the recommended label taxonomy. This is the same taxonomy that I showed you earlier. You can see labels like public, general, confidential, and highly confidential, and also the sub-labels that were recommended under them. You can also see the scope of the labels as per the suggested taxonomy. Now let me click on the confidential all employees label here so that I can show you the settings. So these are the naming details of the label. And then here I have chosen the scope of the label. This label can be applied to files as well as emails. It can also be applied to SharePoint sites and Microsoft 365 groups. And in the future, if you want to extend this labeling beyond Microsoft 365, you can select the schematized asset option as well. Now, this is where we can define the protection settings for groups and sites. Now here I want to define the privacy settings of the site and the external sharing settings when the site is labeled. That's why I have selected these checkboxes. Now, whenever confidential all employees label is applied to a site, the privacy settings of the site should be set to private. That means only team owners and members can access the group, or a team and only the owners will be able to add the members to that site. I don't want to add people outside the organization to this group as guests, so I'm going to leave this checkbox unchecked. Now here I can define the external sharing and conditional access settings. I want the content from the labeled site to be shared with only people within the organization. That's why I have chosen this option. I also want to allow a limited browser only access when a confidential site is being accessed from an unmanaged device. So that's why I have chosen this option here, allow limited web only access. Now here, if you choose this option, users won't be able to download or print or sync confidential sites to their personal machines, or they won't be able to access the content through Office desktop apps as well. Now, using SharePoint, Admin Center, or even PowerShell, you can change the default sharing link type of the documents in a labeled site. So here you can change it to share with specific people, or you can set it to people with existing access instead of only people within your organization. Okay. So when you select only people in your organization, usually the link is shareable with everybody in the organization, right? But when you limit that to specific people or people with existing access, it reduces the oversharing drastically, and then your sites can be easily ready for using Copilot or even the era of enterprise AI apps. Now that I've finished creating the labels, the next step is to publish the labels. Now I have already created a label policy here. Let me show you the settings for that. So here you can choose the default label for documents. So as per the recommended taxonomy I showed you earlier, we are selecting confidential all employees as the default label for documents. Like I said earlier, this is the most important feature of secure by default. Then for emails, you can choose the default label as general. Then you can turn on the feature for emails to inherit the labels from attachments. So example, if an email is labeled and attachment with higher priority labels are attached, then you can automatically replace the emails label with the highest priority attachments label. Or if required, you can also recommend that the users do that themselves. Then you can continue with the label settings and finish publishing this label. So I've already finished publishing the label now. And I'm going to show you the end user's experience for labeling the documents. This is my end user, Megan. Okay, so she is going to open a new Word document. So let's go to Word. And then let's create a new document here. Now you can see by default, it has the confidential all employees label, and there's encryption here such that external users cannot access this file. And this document is secure by default. Now, if Megan wants to share this externally, then she can change the label to confidential trusted people and then share that with specific external or internal people. Now, if Megan doesn't know who the recipients of this document are, then she can select the label confidential unrestricted, which does not have any encryption. Okay. So we at Microsoft are also using a similar approach. We have secure by default. And if we have to share our documents externally with vendors or partners, then even we change the labels like I've shown you in this demo, and then we proceed with sharing with our external users. All right. Now, this is how my end users can apply labels on SharePoint site. So I'm right now creating a new SharePoint site. Let's give it a name. And then I'm going to apply the label confidential all employees to this site. Now notice how the privacy settings of the site automatically become private here. Okay, so you can see the privacy settings here. The public option is not even available. It has been automatically shown as private. Now the site has been created, okay, and a user has uploaded some documents to the site. And now the document is, someone is trying to share this document externally. Now, since external sharing is not allowed on this labeled site, it doesn't let me share this to a person outside the organization. So I'm trying to share it with a hotmail.com address, and you can see it says you can only share within your organization. Also, the default sharing link here is set to people in control zone or all people in the organization. If you had selected the confidential specific people on the SharePoint site, then the external sharing would be allowed and the default sharing link would be set to share with people you choose. Okay. All right. Now let's go to the next step of the foundational phase. Microsoft Purview has many data security capabilities, and some capabilities may require additional licensing and they're not turned on by default. If you have the appropriate licensing, then you can start turning on some of these features to prepare for automation and also implement data security at scale. So we recommend you review some of the steps that are mentioned over here. So ensure that you have turned on ability to process content in Office Online, turn on labeling for Microsoft Teams and SharePoint sites, turn on co-authoring capabilities for files with sensitivity labels. You can also turn on labeling support for PDF files in OneDrive for Business and SharePoint. Then while labeling a site, ensure the label mismatch email feature is turned on because this feature sends an email to the document owner and the site owner about documents that have a higher sensitivity than the site's sensitivity label. Then additionally, you can also turn on DLP analytics to understand the top data protection risks, any blind spots, your policy and posture improvement opportunities in your organization as well. If you have not yet turned on insider risk management analytics or indicators, then you can turn that on. And once the indicators are turned on, you can start using them in the insider risk policies in the future. Then endpoint DLP is also a very important aspect. So highly recommend setting up the prerequisites for endpoint DLP. Again, all the links for setting up these steps are mentioned in the slide, and we'll be sharing this information with all of you so that you can go through these links. Now let me show you a demo of the label mismatch email feature that I was talking about earlier. So this is a SharePoint site and it has a confidential all employees label. Now user has uploaded a document here and this document has higher sensitivity label called highly confidential. So as you can see, there's a label mismatch, right? And the owner of the site and the document owner will receive an email as shown here to fix the issue. So this can be quite a good, I would say, useful feature because you will come to know that there is label mismatch and then you will be able to take actions on them. Then this here is a demo for email label inheritance from attachments feature. So let's go through that. So notice that the email is general by default. Now I'm attaching a highly confidential file to the mail. Now notice that the email is also labeled as highly confidential. Okay, so earlier it was general, and after attaching the higher priority attachment, the label of the email itself changed. All right. So if your files are marked as confidential all employees by default, then users must be trained on managing exceptions on how to share the files with external users. So focus training on understanding why your organization switched to secure by default model, and then train employees on how to change the sensitivity labels, which labels to select, whether to share from OneDrive or SharePoint, whenever external sharing is required. And if they are downgrading the labels, let's say from confidential to general or higher confidential to general label, then justification should be provided for downgrading the labels. So it is recommended to raise the awareness early on with email communications. Then the next step is to combine the power of labels and DLP. So with the recommended labels and default set to confidential all employees, you can include this label in your DLP rule so that you can block sharing to external users. So this is a sample DLP policy. And here you can see the labels are being used, right? So confidential and highly confidential labels. If that content is shared outside the organization, then you can block the users, block sharing to people outside your organization. Then this is an example of endpoint DLP. Endpoint DLP again can help you prevent sensitive content from leaving your endpoint devices. So example, you can block users from copying files labeled with confidential or highly confidential all employees to their personal email or to their cloud drive or even USB drives. You can also block sensitive files from being printed or copied to clipboard. And in this example, Megan is copying a document that is labeled as highly confidential to her personal Gmail address. And you can see endpoint DLP prevented her from doing so. All right, so in the first phase, we explain how to secure new and updated content. In this phase, we will explore. In this phase, we'll explore how to secure your existing data, starting with the most sensitive data. Excuse me. So here you can identify priority sites, like sites from leadership teams, top sites and locations from Content Explorer that contain sensitive content, like let's say credentials or PII information. Then you can add sensitivity labels to your priority sites and also to its document libraries so that any documents uploaded to the library will inherit the library label. All right, so this is an example. So this is my leadership team. This is a SharePoint site and it's one of my priority sites. And this is a document library that contains highly confidential information. So in the library settings, I can set the default library label to highly confidential all employees. And now if any document gets uploaded to this document library, then it will automatically get the highly confidential all employees label. And later with auto labeling using contextual conditions, I can automatically apply labels to other documents at rest in the site as well. Now in the next steps, you can create labeling policies to automatically identify all the credentials and then automatically label the content as highly confidential. Attackers are always looking for documents with user IDs and passwords, right? And we need to protect and encrypt such documents proactively. And Microsoft provides you with the necessary sensitive information types to automatically identify different types of credentials like keys, passwords, or tokens. And then you will be able to automatically label that content and protect that content as well. At this stage, the foundation is well in place, the defaults are secure, and we can start addressing the existing data. And next, you can apply DLP rules for content that is not labeled on your endpoint and Exchange, and you can prevent the sharing of unlabeled sensitive content. So here you can see my DLP conditions. It says if the content is not labeled, you can add additional conditions that says if content is not labeled and if it contains PII or other information, then block the content from being shared outside your organization. Then in the last step of this phase 2, you can use adaptive protection to strengthen your DLP rules based on the user's risk. For example, user with higher risk score can be prevented from sharing sensitive files. Now, please note that adaptive protection is already available to our commercial customers. It is not yet available to GCC, but it will be coming soon to our government customers. So I've covered the foundational and the managed phases. Now, Leo will cover the optimized and the strategic phase, where we will see how you can expand your data protection to your entire Microsoft 365 data estate and also beyond Microsoft 365. Over to you, Leo.
Thank you so much, Bibi. Love that presentation, and thank you for getting us started. Now, as Bibi mentioned, we're going to focus on phase 3. This is the optimized phase. And this is where we're beginning to expand across the entire Microsoft 365 data estate. Now, this phase provides options to help iteratively address all of your Microsoft 365 data. In the earlier phases, we saw recommendations for some initial policies to get users familiar. In this phase, we're getting users ready so that they can progress in different scenarios, specifically with auto labeling. Auto labeling is best for scenarios where you need higher sensitivity than that default label that you saw in Bibi's example. Now, in this phase, we're going to also show you how you can retroactively label existing sites. Now, at a high level, we recommend the following approach. As you see on this slide, you're going to want to identify what's relevant. What's a relevant sensitive information type in your organization? And this is going to be, there's different that you'll see in the demo. We also recommending a label to a user if that sensitive information type is detected between 1 and 9. Now that's flexible and that's adaptable based on your requirements, but this gives users options. And then the next recommendation is automatically applying the label when there's a higher threshold. You're going to see an example of this shortly. So this is sensitive information types. This is in the classifier section within the information protection. And there's over 300 different out-of-the-box sensitive information types that you can leverage, as you see here. There's little to nothing that's not applicable to what you might be trying to identify sensitive in your organization. As you can see, the list is quite extensive. There's also trainable classifiers. This is another type of classifier you can leverage in your automatic labeling policies. And trainable classifiers, they use machine learning, and they can help you pattern match for different types of documents or forms. And these are some examples we see here. For example, financial statements. There's also examples for health and medical forms. These are some common ones that we typically see in SLG. Healthcare is another example. Now, let's edit a sensitivity label so you can see how client-side automatic labeling is configured. So I'm going to edit this label. And now we can see how you can progressively deploy labels using SITs and trainable classifiers. Again, we're focusing on any of these SITs. The examples we have here are credit card numbers, social security numbers. And if it has between 1 and 9 instances, we're going to recommend the label to the users. And we're going to also have a customized message that the user is going to see in the Office application So let's jump over to how this looks from the end user perspective. So users opening the document. Now, normally, based on the secure by default approach, you would have had a confidential label here by default. But this is an example of when a user puts a limited amount of credit card numbers within the document, we're going to see that they're going to be recommended that a label be applied to this particular content just because there's less than 9. Here we see the pop-up, the user's informed, they're educated, they're sensitive information, and they have the option to apply the label to this document. This makes the document secure. It's encrypted, and now it's classified. Now we're going to see a scenario where for automatic labeling, how you can configure the rule that we saw earlier within the sensitive, the label. This time we're focusing on higher threshold. If there's more than 10 instances of credit card or social security numbers or any of these classifiers, we're going to automatically apply the label because this is for higher sensitivity scenarios. Again, the customization of the policy tip. Let's see how this looks for the end user perspective. So now they're going to put more than 10 instances of social security numbers in the file, and we're going to see the experience this time. So they're going to get the pop-up, making them aware that this is now considered highly confidential because there's more than 10 instances of social security numbers in this document. So it's automatically encrypted and automatically classified without any user intervention. Now let's discuss the next step in the optimize phase. This is where we're starting to simulate auto labeling scenarios for data at rest or data in flight. So when it comes to service-side auto labeling, when content's reviewed, it's reviewed at rest in SharePoint and OneDrive and Exchange in transit. Currently, we support auto labeling up to 100,000 files a day. That's pretty significant. This is an example of how you can configure the automatic labeling rule for SharePoint data. We're looking for content that contains credit card numbers, more than 10 instances, bank account and routing numbers as well. So this is the strategy for focusing on the higher content, the higher threshold. Now, once the policy is created, you have the option to do a simulation before you actually enforce the auto labeling policy to sites and to OneDrive. You can also review any items that are matched to ensure accuracy. This simulation didn't take very long, came back with some matches, and now an administrator or privacy officer, risk officer, whoever has this task can come in to the simulation and review before this policy is enforced. Now, client-side automatic labeling is limited to sensitive content. What's detected in the data in use scenario? Service-side automatic labeling, it adds additional features. And BB touched on this earlier. For example, not only can you detect sensitive content within the document, but you can also detect when the content is shared externally or internally. That may be part of the decision tree on whether or not a label is applied. You can also focus in on the file extension, or if the document contains specific words or phrases or properties. These are all additional features that you can enable depending on what your requirements are. So You can also finalize your labeling your documents in SharePoint and OneDrive by focusing on file types like Office or PDF extensions. Now, the goal here is to match the file with the respective SharePoint site. And you want to start this activity with higher sensitivity sites and then progress on to lower level sensitive sites like your general scenarios. Let's see what that looks like in a demo. So here, we're going to go to the finance SharePoint site. Notice that it has the confidential all employees for that SharePoint site. And now we're going to edit the automatic labeling rule. We're going to target the finance SharePoint site. Click next. And then we're going to edit the rule. And we're going to add file extensions for Office files and PDFs. There's also additional conditions that I mentioned earlier that you can leverage. We're going to save the rule, click next, and then we're going to add the confidential all employees label. So any files in that SharePoint site will automatically apply the confidential all employees label. And again, we can run this in a simulation just to see what we get back. So in this next step, step 3, we're going to be focusing on how to reduce false positives with advanced classifiers. And here's some of the recommendations. I'm not going to call them all out, but just to name a few, you can reduce false positives by increasing the required confidence and threshold counts when you're configuring the rule when it comes to the sensitive information type. You can also clone a sensitive information type and adapt it to your needs. You're going to see an example of this shortly. There's also additional capabilities like exact data matching and document fingerprinting that you can use. And these are going to mostly apply to data loss prevention, but another way that you can reduce false positives as you're deploying the secure by default methodology. So here, this is an example of configuring a higher threshold, changing the instance count. For credit card number, it's already by default at high confidence, but we changed it to 15. Bank account number and routing number, instead of medium confidence, we're going to change it to high confidence. And this is going to help reduce false positives. Now, by using both sensitive information types and trainable classifiers, for example, like credit card numbers, bank account numbers, and a trainable classifier like finance, this is going to also help you reduce false positives. Just another strategy you can employ to help if you're getting too many false positives. And notice the and operator. You're going to want to leverage this in your rule instead of the or. So another way that you can reduce false positives, as we saw on the previous slide, is modifying an existing SID. For example, Social Security number. You can actually copy this and then modify it to meet your needs. For example, you can change the confidence level once it's been copied. You can also change the character proximity. So by default, the primary element has to be within 300 characters of the supporting element. Well, you can remove that requirement. Now that you modify it, you can say anywhere in the document, if this primary element, the 9 digits for a Social Security number is there, I want to call that a match. Or on the other side of the token, you can increase that requirement of 300 characters to 500 characters. You can also modify the supporting elements. You can add additional keywords to this keyword list or remove certain. And there's other things if we follow along that you can modify to enhance your reduce false positives. Now, the last step in this phase is automating and improving data protection throughout your Microsoft 365 data estate and focusing on historical content and in-use data. Here, the recommendation is to review retroactively and apply labels on your existing SharePoint sites. We've already seen that default labels have already been configured throughout the environment, and you stopped the proliferation of unlabeled sites and documents. Now you're going to start addressing labeling sites and libraries manually on priority content and scaling this throughout your Microsoft 365 content estate. And these are some of the activities that we see on the slide. We're not going to call them each out for the sake of time. All right, now we're moving on to stage 4, phase 4. This is where we're getting strategic. And the first step involves implementing operational procedures and expanding beyond the Microsoft 365 data estate. These are some of the activities. And I'll just call out a big one that we see here, that third bullet. You're going to want to leverage data loss prevention for SITs, sensitive information types, because previously we've been focused on labels. Now you can start targeting sensitive information types and unrestricted labels, so you can catch those exceptions with DLP when content's labeled without protection and sharing is attempted outside of the organization. Now, step 2 in phase 4 is iterate with new labeling scenarios. Now, keep in mind that this deployment model focuses on labeling scenarios that fit most organizations, just to allow you to quickly deploy, secure your data estate without the need for identifying all edge cases. In this step, we're looking at potential iterations for your organization to consider after the core deployment's done. So, and here's some of the key things, and I'll call out secure collaboration. For this scenario, you may want to consider within the label, if you have multiple domains or trusted partners, consider putting permissions in the label for the domain names that you collaborate with. And then another big one that I'll call out is file shares. This is where you're going to want to start labeling content in your on-premise file shares using the information protection scanner. Step 3 in phase 4 is set up accountability chains and lifecycle management of your SharePoint site. And I think it goes without saying that empowering collaboration in SharePoint, this comes with responsibilities for site owners. So it's important to implement a chain of accountability and lifecycle management with the recommendations that you see on this slide. And some of this governance can be streamlined with a feature called SharePoint Advanced Management. This is going to allow you to do things like site access reviews or getting rid of inactive sites. Now, the final step is extending protection to Azure SQL and non-Microsoft 365 storage. Like you see here, Azure SQL, Azure Blob, Amazon S3 buckets. Now, let's note that this is not yet available in GCC. Currently, it's in preview and commercial. But this is the final stage in securing by default. Why is this important? Well, this blueprint, it's a different approach than the traditional Microsoft information protection deployment approach. Why? Because BB touched on it earlier that previously we saw a lot of customers, they were blocked or their program was slowed because they were trying to get to perfection with automatic labeling. Well, automatic labeling applies to less than 3% of the content. When you enable secure by default, this is going to accelerate your auto labeling strategy. We also saw a lot of concerns around encryption and what to do when things break. Well, now with this guidance, train users on how to manage exceptions instead. Taxonomy was also an issue. You saw earlier in phase 1 or before beginning phase 1, get your taxonomy in order with the recommended approach for secure by default. This is going to help. And I personally see many agencies getting stuck on taxonomy or not having that clearly defined. The recommended approach is going to remove that blocker. A lot of organizations were also stuck on or are stuck on manual labeling and getting users to adopt manual labeling. This is a struggle. Some of the key takeaways: secure by default. This is going to drastically reduce your attack surface and how you can mitigate oversharing and data leaks. Also, leverage DLP so you can deploy. It's easy to deploy, and it's easy to deploy for labeled content and unlabeled content to prevent oversharing and guiding users on what to do and what labels to apply when they're sharing. And then one key thing, you probably saw this loud and clear throughout this whole presentation, is leverage container labels. This is going to be a key to the secure by default blueprint, and use that default library label. So, frequently asked questions. You're going to see this in the documentation, but for the sake of time, I'm only going to call out 2 big ones. Does this replace the crawl, walk, run approach? No, this is just an alternative method to secure your organization by default, review the requirements, and adapt to meet your needs. Another key one is number 3. Can I start without encryption and add it later? You can indeed. Although if the labels that are already deployed without encryption, you can't apply encryption to them later, but you can certainly, for new content and existing content that's not labeled, you can encrypt it. Those are the only ones I'll call out. These are some resources. You will get the deck. You will get the deck along with the recording on YouTube. We'll be sure to share that on the community. And that's it. If there's any questions, we'd like to invite you to come off mute and feel free to ask. Or raise your hand and we'll be sure to unmute you.